What is your rank?
I left as a staff sergeant, E4.
And when did you serve? What were the dates?
I went in active duty on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1969, and I left on January 13th, 73.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Well, both. I had started law school in the fall of '68. In 1968, when I was a senior and making my plans, you could get a deferment for graduate school. In February of that year, the National Security Council met and decided they needed to end the deferments for graduate school because of the need to get more people for the draft. So I went ahead. I didn't know what to do. I went ahead with the plans I'd made. I'd gotten into law school. So I started law school in September, and I got a draft notice about 6 weeks later. And I checked all my options, and it turned out that if I could go into the Air Force on what they called a delayed enlistment plan and join the inactive reserves by the date of that I was scheduled for the draft, that I could avoid the draft and choose the service that I wanted to go into. So that's what I did. And my original draft date was November 20th. So I went to the induction center in New Haven on November 20th, 1968, I guess it was actually, and signed up for the inactive reserve for the Air Force. And the deal was that you got to pick the specialty, the training specialty that you would go into, and that you would start your active duty within 4 months of the time. So I enlisted and then just left and went home. Everybody else went off to the service. I just left and went home, and then they told me, they contacted me, about 2 months later and said, you have to report for active duty on February 14th.
Did you know that it was going to be that quick that they would call you up for duty?
Within that time frame?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I knew it at the outside. It would have been 4 months. It was about 3 months. So you just knew that was coming. Gave you a little bit of time to make plans.
Where were you living at the time?
Well, I was living in New York City. I was at school, so I was going to school. I had an apartment over in the East Village, and the law school was down around Washington Square in New York. But my home of record was Connecticut, so all of the draft activity and the enlistment went through the induction center in New Haven.
And it was New Haven that you had to report to?
Yes, yeah.
Why did you join?
Why did I join as opposed to going to Canada? There were a lot of options in those days. I certainly didn't support the war. I was very much opposed to it. And there was a lot of speculation, what would you do? Barbara Walters' stepson was in school with me at NYU, and I remember one of the more radical proposals that we would form a pact and shoot each other in the foot so that we could avoid service. That one didn't sound too practical. There was, I didn't really feel I was a conscientious objector, because at that time that really was defined as being based on formal religious beliefs. And I didn't feel with any integrity that I could make that claim. I just felt on a humanistic basis that the war wasn't right. I could have gone to Canada, but I felt that had so many implications for the rest of my life, I really wasn't comfortable doing that. So I tried to make the best of it and pick the Air Force, because I thought it would have the least chance of getting me on the front lines, and it would be the least amount of danger in a frankly a very dangerous time.
In hindsight, are you happy you made the choice of the Air Force?
Well, I have a wonderful story about that. On the day that I went down for enlisting in the inactive reserve, the day I would have been drafted, they have an induction ceremony where all the people who are going into the service are inducted at one time. You go into the induction room. It's a wonderful military scenario. It's a room fairly empty with lines painted on the floor, and you line up on one of these various lines. And the enlistment oath is painted on the wall with blanks left, I, and blank for your name, da, 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 enlist in the, and it's left. So if you're in the Air Force, you say Air Force. If you're in the Marines, you say Marines. You know, and everybody does this all together. And I had figured that if I was going to be drafted, I would have gone into the Army. And while I wasn't in great physical shape, and I, had no idea how I would actually go through the rigors of that training, I figured, well, it's the Army. But when we got into the room, as we were about to take the oath, a Marine drill sergeant came in. And he said, I need 7 Marines today. Who are the draftees? And all the draftees had to raise their hands, and he just went down the line and randomly picked 7 of them. So people who had arrived at New Haven thinking they were going to Fort Dix for Army training ended up marching off to Parris Island. And I think if that had happened to me, I would have fallen over dead on the spot. So that was always sort of in the back of my mind, did I make the right choice? Well, that was a frame of reference.
Okay, yeah, I think you told us why you picked the Air Force as opposed to the Army. Do you recall your first days in service?
Yes, vividly.
You want to describe that for me?
Well, first of all, when I got to New Haven, we had a very bad snowstorm in New England. Was one of those things that had shut down everything for a week. So what you did was to sign in at New Haven. There was a physical and a certain amount of processing that you had to go through, and then you got ready and you had to take a bus down to Kennedy Airport as a group. Once you had been sworn in and they had taken the information, you were sent off as a group down to Kennedy Airport to fly to training, which was in Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. So, there was the hassle of getting to New Haven with the snow and stuff. I got there, and I think I got there in time at 8 o'clock in the morning. But it seemed to take them till around 1 o'clock to get us ready to get on the bus. And then it took 4 hours to get to Kennedy because of the snow and the traffic. So we left on our flight somewhere around 6 or 7 and actually never got to Lackland till about 11 o'clock at night. And of course you're just greeted at the bus, and they begin this whole process of just stripping away your humanity of this indoctrination period. So they just took us to the barracks and just said, get into bed. Everybody's just sort of crashed. And in the morning the next day, the whole thing started. When you get to basic training on a weekend, as we did, Friday night and end up Saturday, nothing formally begins until Monday. So you're still organized into flights, about 50 guys who all live in a barracks, and you do everything together. Very regimented lifestyle. So the first part of it, we sort of began finding out how to fall out, how to get in line, how to march, but we didn't have our uniforms. We looked like everybody else on the base was marching around in uniforms. We hadn't had our hair cut off. We still had these ragtag civilian clothes. So you really stuck out, and everybody sort of pointed at you. So that wasn't, it was sort of a shock, but it wasn't until Monday morning when everything really got going, and you realized the stress and the severity of the whole process you were going to go through.
And then that was called boot camp?
Basic training. Basic training.
What do you remember about your experience in basic training?
Oh, lots of things.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
Yes. Actually, I felt that the main person that we had, boot camp in the Air Force was 6 weeks. It wasn't as long as some of the others. He was I would have said an older person, who's obviously younger than I am now. I think he probably was in his early 40s. He was stern, but I had a feeling he was basically fair, whereas some of the other instructors sort of had a mean streak. I didn't feel he had that. He could be a real pain, but you know, at some level, I felt there was a reasonableness to him. I remember one of the things that really concerned me was just being able to make it through the process. I said I wasn't in real good physical shape going into it. I'd always been sort of overweight as a kid and never into athletics. And there was a physical training requirement, probably the least rigorous of all the services, but we did series of exercises, and to get out of basic training, you did have to do a certain number of push-ups, a certain number of sit-ups, you know, run some distance within a reasonable time frame. And there was a graduated training program. So in physical training every day, you would start off with 10 repetitions, and the next week it was 12. So you could work your way up. But even at that, it was hard for me. So I was really concerned. I used to do extra push-ups and things at night, because if you fell behind in the progress you're supposed to be making, they would pull you out of your group and put you into one that was a week behind. So in other words, if it was supposed to be 6 weeks, if you couldn't do the push-ups, it might take you 7 weeks. At week 4, you might be pulled out and say, okay, repeat group 4 with this whole new group of people. And of course, that's stressful because, you know, there's some comfort in getting to know the people. So you'd have to meet a whole new group of people and then just think it's going to go on longer. I want to get out of here. So that was one of the things for me, the press to make sure I could keep up with it.
Were you able to complete it in 6 weeks?
Yeah, I stayed with the flight and was able to do that. It was tremendously regimented, and to me, the whole purpose of basic training, I think, is to get you to stop thinking as an individual and start thinking as part of a group. So I guess my basic operating philosophy in life is if you try to do the right thing and show that you're making an effort, people will recognize that and try and work with you. Well, that's not what they're doing. No matter what you do, they want to make you feel you're wrong, so they'll break your individual spirit and make you feel like you're part of the group. And until you begin to realize it, the whole thing seems totally irrational and antagonistic. And I think there was a point when I got there. First of all, I could never believe that I was actually going to be in the military. I mean, I just never conceived of myself as someone who could, you know, even meet the physical requirements. And I kept thinking, they'll see this. You know, they've obviously made a stupid mistake, and at some point they're going to realize we don't want him. We don't want him. There's no way that you're going to be able to do this, and they'll send you home. And at some point you realize that's not going to happen. No, this is it.
Did you realize that in basic training?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was like about the 3rd or 4th day, and you know, it said, you know, this is it, and I'm in this, and it's going to be 4 years, and it was like, you know, I was 22. A lot of people are 18 at that point, but you know, I was young, and 4 years seems like a lifetime. And my reaction at that point was complete depression. I mean, I was walking around hoping a lightning bolt would hit me. I mean, I was just so overwhelmed by this that I just wanted something to come along and end my existence. And then I think it was somewhere, you know, within the first week or so, someone did in one of the classes sort of explain the idea that why it was so important to feel that you were part of the group and had to follow the rules explicitly. I think the example they used, that if you were an aircraft mechanic, for instance, and the manual required that on an F4 a certain bolt had to be tightened to a certain tension level or the plane would explode, I mean, you can't stop and think about that. You have to know that if that's what the manual tells you to do, you have to do it no matter what happens. And I could begin to see the logic of that, and I guess it, you know, I didn't enjoy the experience a lot more, but it helped me to accept it, I think.
Which wars did you serve in?
Well, I was a Vietnam era veteran. And
where exactly did you go in Vietnam? After basic training, did you ship out immediately?
No. What happened, actually, I didn't realize there were 2 stages to basic training, that, you know, it was 6 weeks, and I thought, oh boy, I'm getting out of it. I thought it was interesting. It was punctuated by sort of inappropriate holidays. I went in on Valentine's Day and left on April Fool's Day. And what happens, basic training is, you know, it's 6 weeks. It's how to salute, what the regulations are. It really doesn't prepare you to do anything. It doesn't vocationally. It's simply the indoctrination to military life. And the second part of it is you go to your skill training. And that can be anything from a 6-week program to almost a full year program, depending on, you know, if you're going, I think some of the munitions programs, you were actually like a 42-week training program. When I went in, part of my deal in this delayed enlistment program for the Air Force was that I was selected to go into photography as a lab technician. Originally, I was supposed to work in with still photography, but it switched to motion picture photography.
Did you get any choice in that skill, or did they just assign you where you're going to be trained?
No, well, they gave me a choice. I mean, it's kind of odd when somebody sits down. I tested very well. When you go in as part of the enlistment process, they do a series of tests. They have 4 categories: electrical, mechanical, general, and engineering. I don't know the range of them. And I tested well, very well, and could go into any one of the ones I wanted to. So they say, well, what do you want to do? And it says, well, what do you have? It's kind of hard to make a choice. And then they also have you fill out a form with what you did in high school, what courses you took, what your hobbies were, and I'd put down the photography been a hobby. So that's how they selected that I would go into motion picture photography. My brother, for example, sort of faced the same situation. He was 18 months older than I was. He had worked in a hospital. He went into hospital administration as his field, and while he was in college, he had worked in a hospital in Baltimore in the personnel office. So, of course, they tapped him for hospital administration.
How long was your photography training? So after this first half was over, then you went into your skill training.
Well, the skill training was a 12-week course, and there are several of these training bases around the country. The photography program was run out of Lowry Air Base on the outskirts of Denver. So on April 1st, I left Texas and went to, and of course, you feel like you're getting out of basic training, and you're so thankful to get out of there. You get on the plane and go up there, and then you get to the airport and at Lowry, and bang, someone hits you and starts yelling at you again. And you go into this same kind of indoctrination. It was very regimented. I was in, my class met in 2 separate time slots. It was almost a 24-hour operation. School was 6 hours a day, and there was one set of classes from 6 a.m. to noon, a second one from noon to 6 p.m., and a third one 6 p.m. to midnight. So you were either on the A, B, or C shift. And lived your life accordingly. If you were on the A shift, you got up at 4:30 in the morning. And again, you lived in a barracks. The barracks in basic training was just 2 open bays. That half the guys lived downstairs and half the guys lived upstairs in a big room with a line of cots in it. Once we got to Lowry, again, they looked like sort of World War II era wood frame buildings, but this one was divided up into 4-person rooms. So you'd have downstairs, it was central hall, and there were rooms off each side with four guys in each room. But you still functioned as a barracks. So at 4:30, you had to fall out. There was a procedure. You had to get dressed. You had to leave the room in inspection order. So you had to make sure the bed was made to very certain specifications. Everything was dusted. Everything was lined up where it needed to be. Your shoes were in a certain order. Then you had common duties that you had to do. You had to make sure the halls were swept, the latrines were clean, and those. And you'd get all those things done, and then you'd fall out. So maybe the lights would go on at 4:30. Someone would come in and throw the switch, and everything was suddenly light. And you begin this frenetic activity to do all these things, get dressed. He has to get into the bathroom at the same time, and get out there. And then you fall out at 5 o'clock out in front of your barracks. and then all the other barracks are also falling out. So you have this whole collection of maybe, well, let's say you've got 40 guys in the barracks and 10 barracks in your area. So you've got 400 people who then all form up in a phalanx and you march to Chow, which was about, oh, I don't know how far down, maybe a quarter mile down. So you march down and then you line up and you fall out one by one, and you go from your formation right into the food line and march through the food line, get your food, and then you go out to a table. When you get into a huge cafeteria, you would, if there was no empty table, you would go to an empty table and you'd hold up your hand, and the next three people would have to go to that table until the table was filled. Then you sat down, and the next person went to an empty table, and so you say that very regimented. You eat, you know, while at least you could talk while you ate, and then you had like maybe between your eating and a little break time, you maybe had 10 minutes, but then you had to fall in again outside the chow hall, and you all marched over to the school.
When you fall in like that, are you supposed to get back in the same exact way?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, and it was all arranged by height. There was a whole procedure, taller tap. There was a thing you would line up, and if you were taller than the person in front of you, you tapped, and you know, and so you get this thing, and it was column of 4, and you did this march, and then when you had to get in the single line, the left column went first, and then the right. You know, so we would all march over to school, and then we would break up and we go. Actually, school was relaxing because you know that was it was actually, I enjoyed the school. It was fun. And then, you know, at 12 o'clock, school was over, you formed up again. And you marched back to the chow hall. And you had lunch. And then you had some free time to go to the BX, but then you had to, you know, at 1:15, you had to form up again. And then you marched back to the barracks. And you had a work detail. And then you would do, when the work detail was over, then you had an hour for studying or something like that. And then you had to fall in and march back to the chow hall, have supper, and then march home. And then you had like maybe an hour to clean the barracks and do these things. You were in bed by 9 o'clock. 8:30 or 9 was lights out. Now, the good thing about that, as opposed to basic training, it was 7 days a week. This, at least you had the weekends off. So this was like essentially Sunday night, you know, at 9 o'clock you fell in, and Friday night, you know, at 6 o'clock, you know, when you came back from your work detail, you were released, and then you were on your own.
Could you basically do anything you wanted?
Oh yeah.
Could you leave the base?
Oh yeah, yeah. And actually, I think the first or second weekend I was at the base, I went down to. I don't know if you know Denver at all, but the main drag is Colfax Avenue that runs through the town. It was a couple blocks off the base, and I found a used car dealership. And this was like 1969. I bought a 1960 Corvair, $350. It was you know, basic little boxy 4-door thing, and so and Colorado was beautiful. I mean, I really loved. I went up in the mountains and explored and things like that. The other nice thing about it was that they never inspected the cars. So, you know, everything in your room had to be, you know, folded and clean, and, you know, so your junk you could just throw in the trunk of the car. You never had to worry about it. It was sort of an escape valve for that. So, yeah, that actually, you ask about the instructor for boot camp. The guy we had as at the squadron, not at the photo school, but the guys we had at the squadron were more the kind of nasty, irrational hard asses. So that was a little bit unpleasant. But basically, you know, everybody got along. It was a fairly decent time. And then that finished in August. And following that, I was assigned to Vandenberg Air Force Base. There was a photo lab. Vandenberg is out north of Santa Barbara. It's
California?
In California. It's about 150 miles north of Los Angeles and 350 miles south of San Francisco. It's beautiful, sort of open country. It's actually the Pacific Missile Range. It's where they fire missiles from the West Coast. It was a Strategic Air Command base. What they did, that was the time when we had all the missiles planted all over the country to shoot at the Russians in these bunkers, and periodically you had to test the missiles. So if you were in North Dakota, and assigned to be a missile squadron out there, periodically you'd have to test your missile. So your number would call up and you picked up your missile and put it on a truck and came out to California and you shot it off. And then, because you didn't want to waste anything, you'd shoot it way down in the Pacific. And then there was a detachment the Navy had down at Johnson Atoll, and they took practice in shooting them down. Fortunately, none of these were armed. I don't think they were armed, and so that was the other part of the game. But it was a huge, had coastline, very bad tides. You couldn't go swimming because there were really bad rip tides. But it was a beautiful piece of real estate. I found it very tranquil after all this training, and I was there for about got there right around Labor Day, and I was there for about 2 months, September and October, and there was an opportunity, or I got assigned to go back to Colorado for a second training course, sort of an advanced level course, and I should have realized what was happening. It was called combat photo, but it was sort of the same thing we did in how to process the movie film, and so I was looking forward to it. I enjoyed California, but I really wasn't making much money as an airman. I think after I traded the old Corvair in for a newer Corvair, and I had quite an adventure getting out to California. The starter motor gave out right outside Las Vegas, and the car was old, so I traded in, and they said, well, you've got a salary now. You can go to the credit union and get a loan. So I did that, and I think. After paying the loan and my other expenses, I had about $9 a week to live on. I mean, all your food was provided, through the chow hall, and gas did cost 25 cents a gallon, and prices were different, but I didn't have a lot of money, so I liked being out there, but didn't have that much freedom on it. So I went back to Colorado, and I remember one day while at lunchtime, while we were doing this school, we'd walked over to the at this point, you didn't have to march anymore either. When you went back for these upper level schools, you were treated more like a guest scholar, if you will. And we just had an informal. We lived in the barracks, but it wasn't as nearly as structured as it had been the first time. Your time was your own. And we walked over to the mail room after lunch. This other fellow who had gone out with me from California, and he got a letter from somebody else back in the squadron at Vandenberg, and we're walking along, and he's reading this letter. He's going, and he comes to this line and says, "Oh, me, Jones, and Nistratoff got orders for Vietnam today," or me, Jones, and Kleinert got orders. That's the first I heard of it. Reading this letter from this friend of mine that I had gotten orders to go over to Saigon.
That is how you found out?
That's how I found out. Yeah.
What was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, I wasn't happy, but I think I understood what was happening a little bit more. First of all, the photo field was fairly narrow. I mean, it was it wasn't like 5,000 people or anything like that. So I knew the detachments that we had over in Vietnam. I knew we had the main photo lab at Tan Son Nhut, which is the Air Force base, the headquarters base, right at part of Saigon. There was another major facility up in Da Nang, fairly close to the DMZ, and I knew that one was more risky. People liked it. I never could understand it. They said it was a beautiful spot, and people liked the service over there. But they were forever getting shelled, so that didn't seemed to be too cool to me. And then we also had bases in Thailand, and, and that was pretty good service. But when I found out that I was getting my orders to Tan Son Nhut, you know, I knew, I had some sense of what to expect, that it was the headquarters base, that it was fairly well protected. You know, I knew some of the people who were there. I mean, basically what they were doing were training of all of us, so they had to have a cadre of people who could rotate, because your service in Vietnam was a year, and then you could come back. So you had to have some place in the States to work while you're waiting for it was to be your turn to go over there and staff the labs over there. So I wasn't quite as flipped out about it as if I'd been in the Army and knew I was going to go over there and go out in the front lines and slosh around through the jungles.
After you found out that you were going to Vietnam, how soon after did you actually ship out and go over?
Oh, that was probably right around this time of the year, no, I think it was actually early December, and I was going over right around the 1st of February.
Do you remember arriving in Vietnam?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Well, the whole process was kind of interesting. For one thing, I went home for Christmas, back to Connecticut, and I decided I wasn't going to tell anyone. Because, you know, I mean, I guess I had a sense of what it was going to be, and you know, I think sort of a realistic sense. And I knew my family would have a completely irrational sense, and you know, and they would probably figure they'd look at me like a dead person already, and you know, I just didn't want to do that. So I went home and I had Christmas for it was like 5 days, and then I went back and finished the training, and then I went from Denver back to California and picked up my car, and I drove east, and I sort of arrived with my car, and I said, well, you know, I didn't want to tell you, but I'm going to Vietnam. And that was, I sort of waited till the last minute to tell them. So I left my car in Connecticut and all my stuff, and then packed off. And what you do, I flew from Kennedy to San Francisco. I think I actually had a flight that left at like 6 o'clock at night and got into San Francisco about 4 o'clock in the morning, or some crazy time. And then you got a bus. You always shipped out from Travis Air Base, and then it got up to Travis, and you had to sign in there, and it was like a huge cattle depot almost. There were all these people that were going over, and you waited around for your flight and everything, and the flight itself was kind of horrendous, because you did it in a series of jumps. They had these planes that were run by sort of, I think it was Trans-America Airlines or something, the sort of a contract air carrier for it. And they took the old 707s and just made them all one class, you know, 6 seats across, like a big cattle car in it. And you had these series of 5-hour flights. You flew from Travis to Honolulu, Honolulu to Guam, Guam to Wake, Wake to the Philippines, and then the last one for the Philippines into Saigon was only about 3 hours, so it was shorter. I had a nice break, a little break in that, because my brother was stationed in the Philippines at the time. He had gone in about 6 months before I had, and his overseas duty was at Clark Air Base, where the plane stopped. So my brother and his wife had joined him over there, and so my brother and sister-in-law came down to the plane when we got there, and we had a chance to visit, about an hour to visit while we were there. So that broke it up a little bit. But I mean, you're getting exhausted. You know, you've left it. I mean, you have no concept of what day it is. You're flying across the date line and all of this. And when you got to Vietnam, they operated, I never quite understood what the issue with American currency was, but they forbid you to use American currency in Vietnam. It was against the law to possess green. You had to trade in your money for what they called military payment certificates. It was sort of monopoly money. All bills, no coins, so you had like a 5-cent bill. They didn't use pennies. Everything was rounded to the nearest 5 cents, and so you had a 5-cent bill, a 10-cent bill, and 25-cent bill, and then dollars. So
this was even on the base?
Oh, every place, yeah, absolutely. It was absolutely free. for some reason, they said the Viet Cong was trying to get green dollars. It allowed them. It was. I never understood the economics of it, but that was a big no-no, dealing in American currency. So you had to trade in your currency. You had to do that first, and then and you arrived with everything packed in a duffel bag. I mean, you didn't bring a suitcase, and so you went to a temporary holding barracks rather than going to your actual squadron, where they just had beds and latrines. And what you did was you got a bed and you took your duffel bag and padlocked it to the headboard and went to sleep. And I passed out, and it was like, I have no idea how long I slept. You passed out, and your eyes would sort of open, and you say, "Not yet," and pass out again. And at some point, you're ready to resume consciousness. So I got up, and then I went to the squadron and checked in. But as I say, I knew some of the people already. I was in the field, so it wasn't that much of a shock. And we had fairly decent living conditions over there. We had a compound. We actually had 2 barracks for the photo
And
people.
this was all right in Saigon?
Yeah, the Tan Son Nhut Air Base is right on the outskirts of Saigon, and there was actually a helicopter. The heliport was in one area, and the barracks was immediately adjoining it. I think there may have been 8 of these barracks in the compound. And then when you crossed the street, the photo lab was directly across the street, so you would go from the barracks right over to the photo lab. We had a fairly heavy work schedule. We worked I think from 7 to 6 days a week. You got 1 day a week off. And when you say it was from 7 to 6, it sort of depended on the schedule of what we were doing. When the lab was operating, we did a couple of different kinds of jobs. One of them was processing the sort of automated film, the film from the automated cameras that were put on the gunships. So, for instance, if somebody went out in a bombing run the night before, they would have cameras actually mounted on the wing of the plane. I don't know where they were exactly. And as they were going along, dropping bombs or something, the cameras would go on when the firing mechanism was activated. So you had these clips of film so that when they came in from their run, one of the ground crew would download the camera, get the film out of it, and ship it off to the film processor. So every morning when you came in, there was this load of these little pieces of film that had to be processed. And movie film it's essentially like slide film in really long strands. So what you would do is to take the individual pieces of film and splice them into one large piece, and then you would run it through the processing machine. My primary job within the lab was quality control, so it was my job to make sure that all the chemicals were at the right temperature and the right strength, and that the process would go over. So when you go in the morning, the first thing you do is turn on the machines, get them up to temperature, and then you run a test strip through the machine. I don't want to get too technical, but there are like 7 or 8 different chemicals that it has to go through, and each one has to be at a certain level, and you can process a strip of film with various shades of gray on it, and you can do density readings on that, and you can, if the reading is off in one area, you can say, well, that's the developer, and if it's something else happens, you say, well, that looks like the bleach isn't working right. So you would do that analysis, and if it's okay, you say, okay, run the, you're okay to run. If it isn't, you had to say, well, we've got to change that chemical or do something like that. So that was one of my jobs. But operational basis, we used to do also was to make up this film. So every morning you had to go into the dark. I had a little dark room that I worked in, and it would take about 45 minutes to take this film. You had to check it to make sure there were no defects and that it wasn't torn so that it would break going through, and put it together in a big roll. And I had a tape recorder, and I'd go in and put on some Beethoven or something and listen to it and work in the dark. It was fairly relaxing, and you'd do that, and then you'd take it. It was ready to go, and then you'd run the thing. And there were certain steps in it where there were times when you had to wait. So in other words, you'd get it, make it up, and do the initial run, and then you might have an hour break before the next step needed to be accomplished. So you could go back to the barracks, or take a long coffee break or something like that. So it wasn't 12 hours of physical labor, intense like that. So it was, I don't know, it was reasonable.
What other kinds of film were you developing for the Air Force?
Well, we also, we had photographers, in addition to this sort of automated film, we had photographers who were covering what was going on in the war. Sometimes they were covering combat operations, and we did lose some of the photographers. That was hard. I didn't go out because I was tied to the machines, but the photographers did have to go out in the field. And then the other thing that was happening, I got there in 1970, in February of 70. It took me just about a year from the time I'd gone into the service. And the Tet Offensive had been in '68, and that had really freaked out the military. And what they had done, as far as I could tell, following the Tet Offensive, was to go out in the areas surrounding Saigon and just devastate it. So I think if you went out, you would have found a band of desolation that no one could really get through. And so it tended to make the base very safe, because they, the Viet Cong had infiltrated 2 years before, and they wanted to make sure that wouldn't happen again. So I think because the war was going so badly, and they were so desperate to find a way out, what they hit on was this Vietnamization strategy. You just turn everything over to the Vietnamese military and strengthen the government so they would be able to take over on their own. It was a strategy which ultimately didn't work, of course, but we spent a lot of time documenting this Vietnamization process. They would be forever going out and turning over a set of tanks, or training a squad to do maintenance on something, and they would want to document the ceremony. So we did that, and actually got into, although we were set up just really to process sort of frontline, to get the original draft, we sort of became a mini production studio, so that we did a little newsreel that we put together, and then we'd have to make 90 copies of it. So you'd have to make an original and then run it through the printer and process all these copies. So that was a different kind of work that we got into.
Did you see combat?
No. We had guns, but in their wisdom, they made sure the guns were locked up. We had a locker. It was a steel locker within the photo squadron, and your gun was kept there. And I think there were only 2 occasions in 18 months when I had to put on my flak jacket and helmet and go get my gun and be ready for something, which never materialized.
So you were in a location, you were not shelled regularly or anything?
No, there were, as I say, once or twice there were, the sirens went off at night, and they had some reason to believe that someone might be launching an attack against the base, but it never happened. On the other hand, I had, the barracks it was sort of a semi-tropical climate, so this was a building that had walls. The walls were essentially screening material. They were wood frame buildings, and they had wooden slats part way up, and the rest of it was just open screening, and then a roof over it. And there were a couple of places in the roof where there was some shrapnel marks. So you knew at some point something had happened. And then, of course, the barracks were surrounded by a dirt bunker that was built in, that was about chest height. So, I mean, you certainly were aware of the potentiality of threat, but it wasn't. It actually was a very calm time for Saigon within the context of the whole war. I was lucky in that.
Did you ever leave Saigon while you were stationed there and go out into the country?
Yeah, not often. I did go out one day, and I was absolutely struck by how quickly, I mean, Saigon was an amazing city, first of all. It was a magnet for all the people who were fleeing the chaos in the countryside. So it had been a city of, I think, something like 300,000 or 400,000 that had grown to 4 million, and had absolutely almost no traffic lights. Traffic in Saigon amazed me. First of all, there were a lot of motorcycles, bicycles, motorcycles. We used to ride on things that were called cyclos, which was essentially a motorcycle with little 2 seats mounted in the front. So you sat in like this little 2-seat thing, and the driver was a Vietnamese person sitting behind you on a sort of motorcycle sitting up above you just a little bit and going along. And then a fleet of Renault taxi cabs that had been left over from when the French had been in Saigon. And then little Lambrettas, which was sort of a little cart that would take maybe 3 or 4 people sitting, you know, facing each other in the back, and the driver would sit in a little cab and have sort of a handlebar and drive. And the Vietnamese currency was called the piastre, so these were called P-cabs. You'd pay a certain amount of piastre to go in them, and you might get, I mean, the Vietnamese were smaller people. They might get, 10 people. If you could get 8 guys in one of those, it was big. But if you were going downtown to have dinner or something, you get a P-cab and go down. But all of this was unregulated. It was horribly smoggy. I mean, there were a lot of exhaust fumes and things like that. But whenever you came to a major intersection, it was kind of an organic process, because you'd have traffic going basically in this direction, and then you'd have a major cross street. And what would happen is the flow of traffic was pretty constant. And then these people were here, and as they were waiting, they'd sort of surge. You could almost watch it throb. And then there'd be a little break in this, and these people would break through, and then they became the prevailing set of traffic. And the other people were sitting here, and they would begin to throb, and then when there was a break, they'd go. So that's, there was no traffic light, but it was sort of an organic process that substituted for it. So it was quite a place.
Do you have any memorable experiences from Saigon?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was, it was a very interesting time. I got to almost feeling as though I was living like an outlaw. I got sort of heavily involved in marijuana, and some heavier drugs later. I mean, I never missed work. I mean, I never went to work stoned, but we did have an apartment off base a couple of times, and we would, a lot of times we would just go after work and stay for 3 or 4 hours and then come back to base. And then later I actually lived down there, but then periodically the terrorist threat would get worse, and they would close the base, and it would go back and forth as to what you could do. But it was a fairly hedonistic time. They did have some wonderful restaurants. The French had taught the Vietnamese to cook, so there was some good food. There were some incredible sort of nightclubs. There was a Filipino band that could imitate almost any American rock group. And they performed in a series of venues. The largest one I remember was called the Fillmore Far East. This was it was a huge room with banquettes, and you would sit around, and this intense rock would go. Everyone was stoned. It was the police. I don't know why the military police didn't crack down on it. They certainly could have if they wanted to, but maybe they figured it would just cause too much resentment. and they would get into some heavy metal stuff. And one of their climactic events, I think, was doing Inagata Davida. I remember Iron Butterfly.
Yeah.
This place would go insane when they would do that. So I remember a lot of those kinds of experiences.
Now, how long were you actually in Vietnam? 18 months?
Yeah.
How come you stayed 18 months for the time of the year?
Well, that's a real interesting one. They first of all, they made a wonderful offer. If you would extend after your first full year, if you would extend your term for 6 months, you could get a free 30-day uncharged leave. In other words, you could take a 30-day leave that didn't come off your leave balance, and they would give you a ticket to any place you wanted to go in the world for free. So that was quite an inducement. Within the 1-year period, you did get a 7-day R&R. There were different sites you could go to, and I in December of '70, I went to Hong Kong for a week and really enjoyed that trip. It was nice. And then February came up, and it was, I had this option. The other thing was, you have to realize that it wasn't a real great treat to be a service person in the U.S. at that time, because you stuck out like a sore thumb. You had ridiculously short hair, and everybody hated you, whether or not you believed in the military or not. A lot of guys had wigs that they would wear when they went off base. You didn't have a lot of money. I was still enlisted and still near the early part of my term, and the lifestyle in Saigon, as I say, it had a certain appeal. And I sort of this romantic notion of the desperado, I guess. I was sort of enjoying that. So I decided, I looked around the world, and I had studied Latin when I was in high school, and I decided I wanted to go to Rome. So I put in for my leave, and I got a ticket on TWA. What you did was to take a military aircraft from Saigon to Bangkok. And once you got to Bangkok, you then went into regular civilian aircraft. So I had a ticket that went from Bangkok to Rome. I actually had a 24-hour stopover in Bangkok, and I had a friend who was stationed there, so I hooked up with him, and a variety of things happened, including a horrible attack of food poisoning. So I lay near death in this very bizarre hotel, wondering, should I call the embassy or what should I do? I finally got that. I was able to delay the flight, so I was 24 hours late and a little weak getting going. And the flight left at 11 p.m. from Bangkok, and it was one of these other flights where you just lose your orientation of time. But we flew from Bangkok to Bombay, India, where the plane had some kind of electrical problem, so we had a 3-hour stop there, and then we flew on from Bombay to Athens, had another stopover, and then finally arrived at Rome. And it was an interesting time. It was funny because I had lived in a foreign country for a year and thought I was really good at adapting and being cosmopolitan, completely ignoring the fact that it was just an American suburb. It was a complete extension of, it wasn't really a foreign country at all, almost. And so it was a little bit of a shock to actually get to a foreign country where people didn't really understand English. Rome in February was deserted. I had a wonderful hotel. I think it cost like $11 a night or something. It was a beautiful, beautiful hotel, but there was hardly anybody in it. And I was suffering from jet lag, so I never got to the Vatican because it was open, to the Sistine Chapel because it was open from 11 to 2, and that sort of didn't coincide with my waking hours. I'd end up being awake a lot at night when nothing was happening, just sitting in the hotel. But I did find one restaurant over near the Pantheon, where there was, I went in, the menu was completely in Italian, but they had an Egyptian working in the kitchen who was on his way to London to study economics. And so he came out and translated the menu for me. So I went there for lunch every day because it was somebody I could talk to and figure out what I was eating. But it, you know, I spent about 6 days, and I saw the ruins and all the things that I studied. It was fun. I enjoyed it. But you then got rooted back to Saigon through California. So I had to go from Rome to New York to California. So I was going to have time to stop home. And I had been away a year. And what I found very interesting in comparison to the Gulf War I and the other military operations that we've had recently, I mean, I really was gone for a year. I did not talk. There were opportunities to use the phone to call home, but I really didn't use them. They weren't particularly good technologies, and I really did not speak to people for an entire year. I was much more cut off. I think now the soldiers who are in Afghanistan and in the Gulf or in Iraq are in email contact, phone contact, cell phones, whatever. I think the distance is there, but I think there's much more contact with what's happening at home, where I really was in a very remote location for that. So I hadn't been home, and all I had to do was go down to the airport and say I want to go home. It was sort of an open ticket. So after about 6 days, I said, well, I guess I'll go. So I went back to New York and spent about 3 weeks, and then flew on to California and back to Saigon again for the next 6 months. That was the strangest part. I had not anticipated the level of alienation that I experienced when I got home. I felt, I read a lot when I was over there. I mean, in addition to the other things I was doing, I did have a lot of time to read, and I really felt it was important to try and understand how we had gotten into this mess a little bit. And I read a lot about Chinese history and tried to understand the area, Vietnamese history and things like that. And I was absolutely convinced that we had completely misread the dynamic of what was going on in Southeast Asia. If you looked at the history of that area, it's a history of people coming out of the north, from China, from the steppes of Central Asia, and progressively trying to move down into the more fertile areas, the more economically productive areas. That's the history of all the dynasties in China. They all came out of this area and took over these civilizations as they got old and tried to move forward. And of course, Vietnam was the breadbasket. It was sort of like the prize. So the thrust of Vietnamese history was to resist this, to resist the push of the Chinese. And here we were predicating our whole policy on the fact that they wanted to align themselves with the Chinese, which they really didn't want to do. So I had you go from there to sort of a radical view of U.S. history and what we had tried to do with the Cold War. So I really had developed a pretty radical worldview that seemed absolutely obvious to me. And I really felt that when I came back on leave and I talked to people, they would understand this and they would all say yes, and it's awful and we've got to do something to end the war. And what happened when I came back, somewhere between when I had gotten drafted and 1970, everyone had started wearing leisure suits and Hawaiian shirts. The whole fashion had gotten kind of mannered and superficial. And I couldn't believe that this was taking place while this whole horrible thing was going on here that they were absolutely ignoring. And I just found I couldn't talk to anyone. And it was tremendously isolating. And then I made a particularly stupid mistake. I bought I think, a Thomas Hardy book to read on the. I think You Can't Go Home Again. I don't remember what it was that I read. Thomas Wolfe, I guess, a very depressing novel on the trip back to Saigon, which was sort of a fluke. But I went into a complete depression when I got back from Saigon. I thought I was sort of manipulating the system and sort of making the best of a bad situation. And I guess when I got back to Saigon, it sort of hit me that this whole thing was morally reprehensible. So that was a hard time.
So then your last 6 months were probably significantly different for you than the first year?
Yeah.
New feelings towards the war?
Yeah.
When you went back for the extension, did you have the same job in the same location?
Oh yeah, yeah. That made it easier going back. I knew all the people. But I think a real sense of personal defeat, that I couldn't do anything about it, and felt guilty, I guess, for participating in it.
Did the other soldiers that worked with you in the Air Force have the same feelings? Did you guys share feelings amongst each other or no?
Oh yeah. There were a lot of strange things that were going on. Some of the black soldiers that I had gotten to know and I thought I really understood began to develop a very separate kind of consciousness, and they saw this much more in the heavy casualties of the black soldiers as a really racist issue, and that while I might be sympathetic, I really couldn't understand what was going on. So there were a couple of cases of alienation from people that I thought I knew on a personal level that I began, that I were cut off from almost by class. And that was kind of strange. And there were other people who, I don't think they were sort of annoyed about it, but they realized it was going to pass, and I don't think they saw it as morally significant as I did.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
There were a couple that were kind of standard.
What were they?
Oh, it was like a Vietnam service medal and the kind of things you just got there for showing up. There was an issue. My lab chief wanted to give me the Bronze Star because he thought I was doing a really good job. I thought I was doing a good job, but I didn't think. I saw that this was going on. I saw a lot of people were getting medals that, supposedly for distinctive heroism. I can understand if you were going to make a career of the Air Force that it was necessary, but I felt it was really degrading the whole process, so I didn't want to do it. And I just had a little conflict with him over that. But.
And what was your rank when you left Saigon?
I guess I got to be what they called a McNamara sergeant. I had 3 stripes, which what was it? You started off with no stripes, then 1 stripe. 2 stripes was an airman first class, and 3 stripes was a sergeant. And I guess it was an E4. It was always one more than your grade was one more than the number of stripes. So if you were a sergeant, you were an E4 and you had three stripes. The 3 stripes originally had been an airman classification, and McNamara changed it to sergeant and made them NC. It was the break off when you became an NCO as opposed to whatever else you are. And a lot of the long-term people resented that, so they called them McNamara sergeants. But I was a sergeant at that point. And then when I left Saigon, I had one last duty station, which was at Edwards Air Force Base, the test base out in the Mojave Desert in California, and I did get another stripe. I was there from November of '71 until I got out in January '73, and I was about halfway through that I got my 4th stripe. Got up to be a staff sergeant.
While you were in Vietnam, how did you stay in touch with your family? You said you didn't use the technology, so you didn't call home. Did you write letters?
Yeah, wrote letters, and I also made audio tapes. We would send audio tapes back and forth, which I've listened to. There are one or two of them I have. Unfortunately, I would get kind of stoned and euphoric. I have no idea what they thought of these rambling things. I would sit out on the back porch, and I'd go ramble on for an hour or so.
But you still have some of those tapes?
I do, yeah.
What was the food like?
Actually, the food was pretty good. We had, they served 4 meals a day. There was a big chow hall that you could go to, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the one that I loved, which was midnight chow. Midnight chow was sort of brunch, I guess. It was both eggs and you know, the things you'd usually see at breakfast, as well as burgers and French fries and stuff. It was, you know, and a lot of times we would go off and spend the evening getting stoned listening to music, and then you'd come home and have midnight chow. So that was pretty good. It was the first time that I realized fried chicken and Mexican food were staples of the American diet. There was a Mexican food restaurant on the base that you could go to, and fried chicken places. I wasn't particularly partial to either of those foods, you know, or I hadn't, you know, from the East Coast, I don't think we were into those as much. But
did you have plenty of supplies? Were there any shortages?
no, there really weren't. I mean, you could get a lot of stuff, get wonderful stereo equipment at rock bottom prices. I mean, some of the advantages of being in the war zone, first of all, you paid no taxes. You were exempt from income tax. I mean, you didn't have a huge income, but at least you didn't have to pay income tax. Plus, you got hazardous duty pay. And there was a small overseas pay differential that you got anyway, but fairly substantial for being in the war zone, and then no taxes. So you really had a lot of sort of disposable money. And then you had access to all the stereo equipment at really good prices, which you could ship back when you left duty-free. So everybody bought fancy cameras and great stereo systems. And the BX would have, you know, well, I don't know that you really needed a whole lot. I mean, life was sort of taken care of. We had, there were Vietnamese women who came in and sort of maintained the barracks. They would come in and wash all our clothes. They just had big garbage cans, and the barracks was organized so when you walked in, you sort of walked through the bathroom part of it, and then there was a little screen door, and then into the room area. So they would just sort of flood the bathroom, and you know 3 times a week and do the laundry. You just leave your, they'd wash the fatigues and everything and hang it out and iron it and do that. So you didn't have to worry about whether or not you had detergent or stuff like that. And the day-to-day stuff they certainly provided. I remember there were certain things that amazed me that they would stock at the BX. They had an endless supply of escargot. You know, these things where you buy the little tin with the snails in the bottom and then the shells on top and the plastic thing. You know, who really wants this? But the escargot was always in the BX. But there were records, tapes and things. You were sort of able to keep up with that. We had the base movie theater, which would get all the movie. They played like 1 or 2 nights, so they circulated a lot of things, but you really kept up with the movies. Good base library. They always had access to you know, current fiction and stuff.
What other kinds of things did they have for entertainment? Well, I know you talked about restaurants and the nightclubs. Did you have anything else for entertainment? Did you ever get to see the Bob Hope show?
No, I never did see Bob Hope. I don't know if he. Well, I think for one thing, we were sort of low priority on that because compared to the rest of the country, we had a lot going on. I mean, I think they really tried when the USO things came over that they would go to the zones or out to Da Nang or the more remote areas. We did have a USO downtown. It was a nice drop-in place. They always had burgers and things ready, but. I just to to go, I mean, when you've got a full work schedule, you know, just to get off work, get yourself organized, go down to Saigon, have supper, look around, and come back would make a pretty full day.
Did you do anything for a good luck charm or any good luck rituals?
Not so much. My younger brother had made a ring. I guess you used to be able to take quarters and sort of melt them down. It was a silver ring that was out of that. He gave me that. I wore that. I felt that was like kind of that's about the only thing I did.
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events? Did you guys play pranks on each other or anything like that?
Well. I mentioned we had these dark rooms. Our photo studios were built in converted house trailers. So what they had was there was this little area, and there was a cylindrical door. It was about, or maybe like 2 feet, like a circular phone booth, and it had 3 entrances. And there was an interior drum that would go around. This whole thing was painted black. It was a light trap, actually. So if you were facing this, there would be an opening, and you would step in this, and then you would spin.
And that's the dark room?
And you would spin, no. This is the entrance. Then you would spin the door like a third of a way around and would open into a room over here. And then you would spin it again, and you would go into a room over here. So that you could come in, you could have the lights off in one, and these were small little rooms. I mean, this was my office actually, but it was maybe, the desk was maybe 4 feet wide, and it was maybe the whole thing was like 4 feet deep. I mean, they were very small little room. But you'd have your lights off, and then someone who if wanted to come in, they could come into the light trap, turn the door, and then come in while you were in the dark. So one of the things we did do was to play tricks. If someone was working in the dark, you'd sort of sneak in and stand there. They wouldn't realize you were there, and then all of a sudden yell at them or something like that, because you really were in darkness. It was when you were making up the film, it was you had to use your fingers to feel everything. You were always very careful to put out all your tools, you know. So we would do things like that. I remember another time that someone decided, a new person came over, and they decided we needed to increase the maintenance level of the lab, so we had to strip the floor and re-wax it or something like that. And it came out with a completely ridiculously high level of gloss, which was extremely dangerous. It was terribly slippery. It was a stupid thing to have done. And our captain, who was kind of a jerk, came in one day, and he at a fairly fast pace, and he came in through the thing, and we had just done this, and he just, feet went up and fell right on his ass. that was pretty funny.
Did you guys all laugh?
We sort of snickered, and then of course we had to strip the floor again and put down a low sheen finish.
Do you have any photographs?
I do have. I've got slides that I took because I used to be able to process them a lot. I had my own. I was interested in photography, and I would take slides and I could process them. They're holding up pretty well. I actually made a movie one time, and I found it. We went downtown with one of the photographers, and we drove around. And a couple of years ago, I took it, and I thought I would try and get it transferred, and unfortunately, it was obliterated. There's almost, you can barely see the image. It just dissolved off the film. That I really miss, because that would have been fun to see. But you know, I watched the movie The Quiet American that came out recently, and it's amazing. It's a very accurate depiction of Saigon, the Continental Palace Hotel. That's where I had my 25th dinner, birthday dinner. Yeah, it was very evocative of what Saigon looked like, and I wish I had more pictures of that.
What did you think of your fellow officers and your fellow soldiers? Did you develop any relationships with your fellow soldiers? Yeah,
I had some very strong friendships. They tended, a couple of them lasted for a few years after the service, but I'm not in contact with anyone. I really haven't been for years. I think people went in different directions, and I think basically they wanted to move away from what had happened.
Did you keep a personal diary or journal while you were over there?
No.
Do you recall that the day your service ended?
Yeah.
Where were you and what was that like?
Well, I was stationed at Edwards, and I got a month early release. I was going to get out on January 13th, and by the time I got back to Edwards, it really was a desk, not a desk job, but a day job. The lab worked from, I think I worked from 8 till 4:30 or something like that, and I was in a NCO barracks. Edwards it's the largest base in the country with the smallest population. It's out in the middle of the desert. It's built around a dry lake, Edwards or Rogers Dry Lake, which is a lake bed that's 7 miles long. It's completely different. When you look at it, especially from the air, you see this whole lake. It's even got some islands in it. There's just no water most of the year, and it becomes like solid pavement. So of course, if you need a real long runway, that's why the space shuttle landed at Edwards. Of course, I was there before the space shuttle. It's much more developed than it was then, but there were very few people out there. And we had it's not that far from Los Angeles. It's only about an hour and a half, close to Palmdale and Lancaster, but the base itself is pretty remote. So, you know, I had a room in the NCO barracks. Again, I did a lot of reading during the week, and then I would take trips up into the mountains during the weekend. I was there for about a year, and then, you know, I had no intention of re-enlisting, so you know, my enlistment was going to be up. And you always got a certain amount of time to out-process at the end. So I went into the photo lab there was primarily run by civilians who worked for the Air Force with the Air Force personnel assigned for certain tasks. It really was someplace for us to be stationed while we were waiting to be rotated back overseas. So it was friendly, and it really didn't have a very military sense to it. It was, you know, I just happened to be wearing a uniform. And so I went into the lab chief, you know, right before Christmas, and I said, well, you know, I'm getting out on the 13th, and you know, how should we? She said, well, why don't you work through the 23rd? You know, it was going to be the last day we were working before Christmas, and then, you know, just consider that your last day of work. So, you know, I had the Christmas break in the out processing time, which, you know, I could have done like in 4 hours, but they gave me like 3 weeks. I had to have an exit physical and, you know, fill out some records and things and process. And I spent most of the time camping. I went up into the Southern Sierras for New Year's, and with a friend of mine, we camped out at a hot springs. It was very, very sort of tranquil and peaceful. And then I went back to the base, and on the 13th, wearing civilian clothes, I went down to the main administrative building and signed a few papers and got in the car and drove away. It was amazing to me, for something that had so controlled your life, that it just evaporated. You know,
Quickly?
oh no, it took me years to get back into what I would call a productive lifestyle. 3 years.
What did you do in the days and the weeks following your?
Well, I was returning back to the East Coast, from California. I had a lot of friends who were stationed down at in Santa Barbara, at another air base where there was a large people I had known in Saigon who got shipped there as opposed to Edwards, and I used to spend a lot of weekends down there, and I went down to see them. I had had a sort of unfortunate incident in October before I got out. Veterans Day was scheduled for in October in those days. I don't know if you remember, but at one point they changed the federal holiday because they wanted to make them all 3-day holidays. So they had Columbus Day, and then 2 weeks later they had Veterans Day. So like around October 25th, I was going camping, and we were going down an area outside of San Diego, and I got arrested for possession of marijuana. I had like a joint rolled up in a little baggie in a shirt pocket, and we were going through this little town of Ramona. I had an old VW bus that was converted into a camper. It was sort of suspicious looking vehicle, and the policeman pulled me over because I guess my taillight was out, and he searched me. He said, "I smell dope." And so I spent the holiday weekend in San Diego jail in the felony tank, and ultimately I pleaded I pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor of being in a place where marijuana was being smoked, and it got resolved. I never really had to, it was handled through a lawyer, and when I got back to the base, the commander said, well, he said, I'll tell you what, wait till you get the civil justice things taken care of, then come back and let me know what happened, and we'll see if we need to do anything as the Air Force. But of course it got resolved. I was getting out, so nothing ever happened with the Air Force with it. But I just felt like, I had escaped. So I went back to visit these friends in San Bernardino, and lo and behold, they had just gotten busted. A really fluky incident with, they lived in a 2-story house, and the woman downstairs was being investigated by the police, and the police had come upstairs to ask them some questions, and they saw a hookah, or a bong or something. So then they came in and got a search warrant and arrested them. So all I could think of was, if I had been here and gotten arrested a second time. So I thought it was time to get out of town, out of Dodge. I had another friend who had been stationed or who had lived in Las Vegas. He'd gotten out about a month before I had. He'd grown up in Las Vegas. So I went over and saw him. And then I had another friend from Vandenberg, who we'd been in Saigon together. We were real good friends. And he had bought a VW van when he got back from overseas. And we decided we were going to drive back to the East Coast in tandem. So he met me in Las Vegas, and then we headed out on this adventure across the country.
Buses going across country?
Yeah. His was brand new. His was deluxe. Mine was old and had some problems. One of which was the heating system was almost gone in it. And this was January. And we took the route through northern Arizona across old 66. And I can remember that sometimes it would be 60 miles in between towns. And not only that, the other fault of it was that it would pop out of gear. So I had to shift it into fourth or whatever the gear was, and I had a bungee cord that would hold it, but even that, so sometimes I physically had to hold it. And between holding the gear shift and my feet getting so cold because there was no heat, I thought I would get frostbite before I could get to the next place and go into a rest stop and have a cup of coffee and warm up. But finally we made it back to the East Coast. And
when you got back home, did you go to work or did you go back to school?
Neither. There was a special unemployment, you could get 6 months of unemployment benefits without a whole lot of questions. There was a special line when you went to the unemployment office. There were all the people, A through F and G through whatever, and then there was the group X or some special. So I got to do that, and they didn't hassle us as much as they did the regular people. So I lived on the unemployment benefits for 6 months, and I had a good friend from high school whose family had moved up to rural Maine. So I sort of split my time between sort of hanging out in Connecticut and hanging out in Maine, and ultimately moved up to rural Maine. I came back. I got out in January of '73, and I began my first serious job in October of '75. It was a fairly long gap in between. I read subsequently that Time magazine had sort of identified my situation. I was in the post-Vietnam psychiatric syndrome, hanging out with a great deal of lethargy and a drug-induced state or something like that. It's sort of described. It was not a good time.
Did you join any veterans organization?
No.
What did you do as a career after the war? I know you were in law school before the war. Did you continue with that?
No, I had sort of dropped out of that, and 4 years later, I really didn't want to participate in anything that smacked of the establishment. Law school was about as establishment as you could get. I sort of wandered around from things, and ultimately there was a Labor Department program, CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, that had supported employments for different categories of people. And I ended up getting myself declared eligible for CETA, and then you go out and find a placement. and actually found a placement at the University of Maine in Farmington in the grants office. And that's, you know, quite by accident. That's how I entered my profession.
And what is your profession now?
Research administration.
At Central Connecticut State University in New Britain, Connecticut?
Yeah.
Do you attend any reunions?
No.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war, about the military in general?
Yes. I think war is only possible if people are willing to fight it. So, you know, I'm very ambivalent about the military, and I think the country has been. I mean, it took us a long time from the end of the fall of Saigon to the point that we were ready to look at action in the Gulf. I think the first Gulf War probably was justifiable. I don't think the current one is. But, you know, I don't know whether it's unrealistic to think that you could allow soldiers to vote on whether or not they want to go to war. But certainly if it weren't such a rigid structure, it would be harder to get into such unreasonable activities as we got into Vietnam. Unfortunately, I think we're engaged in a kind of unrealistic activity right now, but there's still a fair level of patriotism. As unpopular as the war is, the soldiers are supported to a miraculous degree. That was not the case in the Vietnam War.
How did your service and experiences affect your life? Do you think your life would have been different?
Yes.
Drastically?
Drastically different. I think I was programmed to go in a certain direction, and that got completely derailed. I have no way of knowing what kind of neuroses I would have run into had I gone on the other track. There's absolutely no way of knowing it. There was really something very healthy about it. As much as I resented what happened, I think it brought me into contact with a much broader segment of the population than I might have ever met. And for that, I am appreciative.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered in the interview?
No, I don't think so. There are some things I really don't want to talk about, but I think this was a very positive experience.
And in the beginning, I didn't get, would you tell us your full name and your current address and your birth date?
Yeah, my full name, actually my first name is William. Dean is my middle name, but I use that, so it's William Dean Kleinert. And I live in Farmington. I'm at 26 Tunxus Village Drive in Farmington, Connecticut. 06032 if you need the zip.
And your birth date?
Oh, April 25th, 1946.
Well, thank you very much, Dean.
It's been fun.